Hello, I'm James Warren.
And I'm Andy Cushion.
And this is the Denver Urbanism Podcast, a podcast on every single bus and train in the city of Denver.
Welcome to two new guests who have not yet been on the podcast. It's a pleasure to have you here, James and Emma. James, can I have you introduce yourself and then Emma after?
Yeah, great to be here. Yeah, my name's James Flatham. I am one of the co-founders of Greater Denver Transit.
Yeah, and my name's Emma Griffin, and I am a co-lead of Greater Denver Transit.
So, Greater Denver Transit is, I think, probably the largest remaining group that we had not yet spoken to on the Denver Urbanism Podcast, as we've gone deeper into kind of trying to connect folks to what advocates are up to and what advocacy looks like in Denver. But James and I have talked a lot about transit before, and that transit has been in Denver, and some of it's been great-ish. So, what is Greater Denver Transit? Let's just start there. Like, what's the gig?
Yeah, so we are one of probably the younger urbanism groups here in Denver. We only got started at kind of the end of 21, and we didn't really get kicking right until probably like 22, Emma, would you say, right?
That sounds right, yeah.
And really kind of the group came out of, there was kind of a void in the time. And in Denver, there was not really an obvious place where you could go and you had a group that was open to non-professionals, right? People who were outside of the infrastructure transit industry, right? Where you could talk about solutions for transit. So I could just give you guys maybe the background on just how we got started. When I moved back to Denver in 2021, one of the first meetings I had was with Professor Ken Schreppel, who runs CU Denver's Urban Planning Department. And I laid out kind of thing I was interested in getting involved with. And this was at a time when there was really a lot of negativity around RTD. A lot of really frustrated, folks on Reddit, talking about, doom and gloom with the system. And it was a really difficult time, right? Because this was still, we were kind of in COVID still. And kind of I laid out what I was looking to get involved with, and he said, well, that doesn't exist, but you should start it.
Sounds like Ken. Yeah.
Well, good professors are always encouraging their students to start new projects. No, Ken's a great mentor. We're very glad that another great thing has come into the world. He also is somewhat of the patron saint of this podcast. Mm-hmm. So then I want to hone in on what you just kind of mentioned there. Professional organizations do exist for like maybe the transit providers themselves or transit planners and things like that. Talk about the need for just a sort of public open space for non-professionals. Like what then is the niche that GDT is filling?
Well, the hope was that over time, right, we would become kind of a point where the different train, transit, bus, mobility interests could intersect, right? People who were coming at transit because they're really nerdy about maps, right? They love thinking about redesigning transit maps, the people who are really interested in and nerdy about the vehicles, but also, right, the advocacy side, the people who are coming at this, who are really serious about transit being a social equalizer, as something that can enable people to have access to opportunities, have access to geographies they would not otherwise be able to. A lot of folks who ride RTD, right, are either unable to afford a car or physically unable to drive, right? So kind of a place where the people who were transit professionals or who were consultants, could participate. And certainly we've got plenty of those folks at GDT, but also just the people who want to get involved because they want to see transit better, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I would just add that Denver is notoriously kind of a transplant city. And, GDT is a place for people who have lived in other parts of the country or the world to compare sort of like transit stories of like, what was it like in New York? What was it like in LA? What was it like in Tampa, Florida, where I came from? And sort of like gauge where Denver's at, compare it in terms of like ridership recovery with the pandemic, and sort of say like, hey, we've seen transit operate better and worse. What can we learn from that and bring to Denver? Versus sort of like you were saying, like with the more professional transit class of people who it's their day-to-day 9-to-5 job, they may have the blinders on in terms of like, well, I need to get this project done, I need to like get this thing done. And we often take more of a zoomed out approach of like a long-term lens of like, where are we headed? What are we doing? What are the short sights? Like we don't have like a short-term project that some manager is going to tell us to deliver. We have sort of like a goal of actually getting people to ride.
I also think that in our case in Denver, somewhat uniquely, it is an all-elected board. which I also think is kind of part of this, is that, there has been a history in Denver in the past of people coming in and having a strong feeling about the direction RTD should take, and it can actually fairly easily be captured by a small group of people. And I'm not saying that that's the gig here, but, if you don't have advocates that are engaged with the process of being the public and interacting with RTD, then you're going to end up with sort of a group of people who actually don't really have the sort of goal of getting more transit to more people in more places as their kind of MO as they get elected to RTD. I do want to ask a question about elections, though, before moving on from kind of what GDT is, because I think this is also fairly unique. I think a lot of the other organizations in Denver do maybe endorse folks or will sort of say, here's an issue that we think matters. Mm-hmm. But I do notice, I know that there's some folks like with a Transform RTD kind of platform. Am I wrong to think that there's some kind of connection to GDT, or is this a sensitive thing that we should not?
No, I wouldn't say it's sensitive at all. I think Emma can speak to this a lot more fluently from the experience perspective, since I think, Emma, you've been probably more than any GDT lead, right, on the ground supporting campaigns. Right, but I think just very briefly, and I'll let you take it away, right, is that we've been absolutely involved in the transformation of the RTD board in terms of an entity that has hopefully got a lot more voices who are really serious about the rider and the rider experience. But I think you're more equipped to speak to that.
So I think we intentionally wanted to be sort of like a voice and offer sort of like volunteer, whether it's like expertise or knocking doors, distributing literature, gathering signatures, helping out candidates who we'd vetted and determined like actually cared about transit and wanted it to get better. Especially because in the last RTD election cycle, like we saw a ton of money and influence go into these races that, historically have been sort of ignored, right? I mean, like it has been an elected board, but I think the last election was, for the District A race, it was an unprecedented amount of money that went into it. And we had people all up and down the state basically like throwing their hat into the ring, different orgs. And so, we were sort of like a low money, but like high energy, like high effort volunteer offering group that was deeply involved in the process.
And in that regard, a professional organization maybe can't really act in that way,
right,
in the way that an advocacy group can. So another valuable element to what Greater Denver Transit kind of gets to do.
Mm-hmm. One of the scarier things I think that we've learned as we've gone through this is that there really isn't freedom of speech in transit, especially in the professional side of transit. If you are paid by a transit agency, or if you are even indirectly, right, if you just do work for a transit agency, right, it's a lot more difficult for you to criticize or elevate things that aren't working and have the confidence that, you will not run afoul of your employer, right? So this is one of the things in terms of the advocacy side where it's really important, I think, to have people who come at this for so many different angles.
Yep. Yeah, and I think like the group is intended to be sort of like this vehicle through which people can volunteer their time and their effort. We can come to a consensus democratically, and then the group can sort of express these opinions so that people aren't putting their jobs on the line, ideally. Like they can help out without fear of retaliation or something else.
So you're trying to get people on the board, you're advocating for better transit service, right? But what does that amount to? Like, can you talk me through what y'all want as an organization, why you want those things kind of specifically, broadly? We can take this a number of different ways, but, obviously we've seen a bunch of Redditors online whining about transit. That's
Sure.
not you, right? Like you're presumably some level above that, right?
Yeah.
Organized and asking for specifics. So what are those specifics and why do you want those things?
So before I think we get into like what we're aspiring to currently in the future, I do want to talk a little bit about like what we've already seen, like sort of some of the wins we've already found.
Yeah.
So
great.
recently the board banned ad wraps on Windows, which is something that we
Nice.
have been talking about for years, right? Like we've been advocating for, and something I genuinely, earnestly don't think we would have got had we lost some of the endorsed candidates' elections in the last cycle. So I think we've already seen the fruits of those labors, to kind of like get at your point, but like obviously we don't want to stop there. So yeah, I don't know if you want to talk about some of the things that we're cooking.
Yeah. Well, I would say that starting with values, right, I think there's different nuances, right, that different members feel, passionately on different subjects. But I think where you do see a convergence is we need a system where transit in aggregate is more competitive, right? And it brings value to more people's lives. I think there's some people in GDT who are transit absolutists. They want to live in a city where there are as few cars as possible. Then there's other folks who say, well, I want to have a car, but I want to use it less, right? I want to live in a car light society. And I think GDT includes both of those groups of people.
Absolutely.
So what we kind of define as valuable or useful transit is transit that is, by and large, fast, frequent, reliable, and accessible, right? Transit that is fast in terms of it gets you from place to place in a time competitive manner, usually not totally even with driving, but is competitive when you factor in the inconveniences of parking, the cost of parking, and stuff like that. Frequent as a kind of word for measuring convenience, right? Transit that runs every 20 minutes, every 15 minutes, ideally every 10 minutes on kind of the highest capacity, highest demand routes, to where you don't need to look at a schedule. You don't need to memorize a schedule. You just you get familiar with where you're going, you get familiar with the system, and you just feel confident showing up and going, right? Reliable, I think that's been one of the biggest problems that RTD has stumbled on in the last 5 years, right? Is that post-pandemic, there's been crippling reliability issues particularly on the southern light rail lines. But the need for the system to be reliable to retain riders, right? To have people believe that when they leave their car at home, they go to work, they go to the doctor's office, they go someplace, they trust that they can get back, right? And then accessible, right, there are so many different kinds of people who ride transit, and many of whom have a disability of some kind, right? And people who have either some kind of mobility disability, an intellectual disability, whatever it is, we need a system that can deliver for those folks too, right? Because we're a community and we want to include those folks. So I think kind of from a value standpoint, right, we can define good transit somewhat abstractly. What we, I think, define as what are the specific things that we advocate for, right? Technically speaking, we need a transit system where you ultimately are able to get from where you live to where you need to go in a way that doesn't require enormous amounts of laborious effort to have to map out and plan. It needs to be seamless. It needs to be convenient. And part of that is one of the weaknesses of the Denver network in particular is that there's just way too many transfers. If you start in one corner of the city and you go someplace else, it's very rare that you will have only one single transfer because the system and the network is designed where you will almost certainly have at least one transfer in downtown at Union Station. If you're going north-south or east-west, you are almost certainly transferring at DUS. But the problem is that usually most people don't live next to a train line. Right? So you will have a transfer usually at the beginning of your journey, and that assumes you don't also have a transfer at the end of your journey. So for us, it's a matter of how can we reform, incrementally expand RTD's network, adapt its network to be ideally more of a single transfer network, where you can get from where you are to where you're going in one transfer or less, right? So that's technical changes. And then there is all the other subtle things about the experience that can lower the hurdles for people who are new to transit, right? In terms of the quality of the information, the ability to recognize where you're going, to be able to find the point where you've decided where you're going, that you can trust, right? That I'm in the right place, I'm waiting for the right bus, I'm waiting for my train, whatever it is, and to not be constantly questioning, oh my gosh, is my bus going to get here, right? Am I in the right place? All of those things that confirm for the rider that this is gonna work. My journey is gonna, RT is gonna show up. It's gonna get me where I need to go, and lowering those hurdles in so many ways.
I think like a good heuristic for that is like if someone is visiting Denver and they've never been here and they're on vacation, if they can navigate the transit system to get everywhere they need to go without being confused, like that's a good metric of, is the system legible? It's not like the people who ride it every day who are used to the quirks of it, who are used to the oddities of RTD's network. And so I think that's sort of like what we should be aspiring towards.
There's the ambitious version of this, and then there are actual like pragmatic changes that get there. So in an ambitious world, like I went to Copenhagen recently. Everyone's tired of me talking about it, but I'm not going to shut up. And it was great. I biked hardly at all because the metro was just very easy in Copenhagen. And that made the biggest difference. I had a friend who like grew up there. I was prepped a little bit on how to take the metro there. It wasn't like that hard. But the sort of the effect then of being confident in a city, Denver has had certain services that actually people do take to and has been ahead of the game in certain ways. I mean, the free mall ride was like a meaningful investment in downtown mobility and some amount of tourist. I don't know if it's tourist centric as a service. I don't know that anybody really
I mean, I think the mall ride is a great case point of like, if you do nothing else but simply just increase the frequency to something really high, you will automatically get ridership pretty much.
Yeah.
If it's in a good place. Like, it's a great example of like, what if we just did this one thing perfectly, which is perfect frequency, the ridership will just come in a dense area.
And so then, like the mall ride probably seemed extremely ambitious when they did that, 50 years ago or whatnot. Thinking about the actual constraints that we do have in RTD, assuming that we don't get like gobs of money coming from some future federal administration that loves transit operations or gobs of money from some very generous tax payers, like there are still things that we can do to make the network work better and to sort of reduce the number of transfers and things like that. What are some of those efforts then that you guys are kind of, involved in that can happen within the given constraints we have?
Sure. So I guess I can maybe start with some of the physical pieces.
Sure.
One of the first campaigns, one of the more technical projects we did was focusing on downtown Denver, right? A lot of our membership, being urbanists, a lot of us live close to kind of the inner 5 or 6 miles of downtown, right? So starting with, we've got a lot of service that already exists in downtown, right? We've got a lot of buses. If kind of some of the assumptions you were making, right? If money doesn't fall from the sky, or if, we don't have a whole bunch of operators that just pop out of the void who want to, run RTD buses and trains, right? How can we make downtown work better? Right? How can we use this as a case study to kind of apply some of our values about making the transfer experience easier, making the system more accessible, more legible, right? And that's kind of what we started with, is that we'll start with where we already have the frequency to play with. How can we tweak the route geometry, right? To shave off, a minute or two of run time by avoiding some excessive turns in downtown that can get very congested, even in a post-pandemic world. How can we align these stops for buses to make the experience for somebody who's transferring in a mobility device, a wheelchair, something like that, a lot more likely that they can make their connection, that they're not going to have to rush across, multiple intersections, as is the case, unfortunately, today in downtown, between 15th and 17th Streets being kind of the busiest bus zones. So starting with downtown, starting with some physical geometric changes to the bus system, as well as how we promote the bus system as well. Then there's some other campaigns like what Emma was talking about in terms of the rider experience, changing how and kind of standing up for the rider experience in terms of how we prioritize different revenue streams, right? Where we looked at the ad wraps. Mm-hmm. And this is something where fundamentally there's kind of just a social equity issue buried at the bottom of this, right? Whereas if someone can afford to drive a car, they never put those kind of little those dot wraps on the edge of their windows to advertise something, right? It's a basic dignity that when someone rides in a vehicle, they get to look outside, right, unencumbered. And we identified that really early on as riders, right? Because we've been to other places where they don't cover the windows with ad wraps and stuff like that. We started where kind of we as I think, Emma, what's the word? We kind of call ourselves transit sickos.
Yeah, I would say that for sure. Definitely transit sickos.
Could you just talk a little bit about just kind of where we're coming from of just our devotion to transit and kind of the unique place where we're coming from?
Yeah, I mean, I think, like, to James' point, though, the ads that are on transit are not for the transit riders, right? It's like for people driving cars parallel to the bus or the train on the interstate, and so it's kind of degrading, right? This idea that it's like you've already paid a fare, right? And you've already paid taxes, and yet, like, you are going to be inside of advertising, which is just, I think, absurd. I don't know, like, it's something where it's like, I've ridden the light rail multiple times where I've gotten a headache from the dots that are covering it. Like, it's like, I literally will just not look out the window, which is frustrating because, like, Denver's a beautiful city, right? Colorado's a beautiful state, especially in fall, and I want to enjoy it. So yeah, I would say we are transit sickos in that, like, I don't know, we care about riders, which I think is like a fleeting position, unfortunately, that we'd like to turn around.
And there's just kind of this willingness to put up with it, right? Is that, like, especially post-pandemic, we've, I think, probably gotten a reputation for being one of the entities that can be really hard on RTD, right? Mm-hmm. There's a former board member, her name is Kate Williams, who called us, "You are our greatest champions and also our fiercest critics." right? And that's kind of where the balance that we have to thread, which is standing up for the value of transit, how it's really important, but also there is a little bit of kind of furiousness that motivates us, right, to engage in this, because the transit experience is not where it needs to be, right? And there's elements of it that are outside of the agency's control, of RTD's control, in terms of the pandemic happened, right? The Uber and Lyft revolution happened, right? People have more choices today than they did, back in 2008. But at the same time, there's stuff within management's control where the agency has not adapted and not modernized its transit product. And I think that's kind of where we're trying to come in informed as much as we can with all the limitations of RT, their financial resources and all that stuff, but offer specific things of, hey, this ad wrap thing, this is a bad resource, right? We estimated it costs, it earns RTD somewhere between only the actual amount of window coverage, the ads on the windows themselves, estimate somewhere between $200,000 and $500,000 a year.
Yeah.
Right, on a network that's got like a $1.1 billion budget. Right. This is a bad revenue source. This is a bad trade-off. Right. And what we hope can happen going forward, because RTD does face some really serious challenges, which we can talk about, is we need to be really soberly focused on what are the real revenue streams that RTD has in its control between fares, right? Monitoring its sales tax, working with our state partners at CDOT, with the Gov's office, with a lot of our city partners in Denver, right, who have come forward in multiple occasions they want to be partners. And how can we as advocates make those partnerships more likely to happen?
So something I'm actually kind of picking up on is that like RTD, at least for the past handful of years since the pandemic, has really been focused a lot on captive riders, those who have to ride the bus or the train in order to live their lives. They don't have access to a car, or they can't use it for some reason. And that's an admirable thing. I'm not saying you don't care about captive riders, right? But like they've been really focused on like, how do we ensure that we're not just like totally failing those people? And when you're thinking that way, you put ad wraps on windows, right? They're captive riders. It doesn't really it doesn't matter if it's a great experience necessarily getting there. It's about getting there. And you're very focused on capturing more choice riders, people who might otherwise have driven. And ad wraps mean a lot in that context, right? Not just, I was riding the W home when I used to live in West Colfax, and there was a bald eagle flying next to the train, and I had an ad wrap on my train. And I was like, because I saw it coming from a previous window, and then it was like in my window. What a tragedy, right? And so I don't own a car, but like I could go out and get a car, and like if I had been able to see that eagle, I'd be like, oh man, I'll never forget that. I'm never doing anything else.
Right.
I guess my question here is like, how do you see RTD capturing more choice riders?
Yeah, and I mean, I think like you hinted at something important, which is like sort of the internal mentality about transit that, like, whether implicitly or explicitly spoken by RTD execs exists, right? Which is this idea of like, there's these captive riders, there's these transit dependent people who have to ride. Sort of the only talk in terms of improvement is like, how do we make their experience better? Which is super important. We should do that. But, like, people don't talk that way about like New York, about Berlin, about Tokyo, about these places where the people who live in these cities have the financial means and the ability to drive, but they don't because it's radically more efficient to take transit, right? And I think that needs to be the proper mentality that Denver has, even if it's aspirational, right? Even if we acknowledge that, like, the transit system we have today for most people going most places is not competitive with driving. But it is some places for some trips for some people. And we should look at things that have succeeded, things that have worked, that people do like to take, like the A-Line, for example. We should improve that service, and we should replicate that quality. And that's going to come from talking to people who don't take transit and figuring out why they don't. And some of that is going to be like, you built a service network, 50 years ago, that was entirely designed to get people to downtown, like you were saying earlier, and get them back home to the suburbs. Which is not what everyone's doing all the time, right? It's like, I work remote. I take transit all the time, but a lot of my transit trips are not going into downtown and back out. It's going from where I'm at to another area that's not in downtown and back. That's where I think we're going to need to see a lot of service changes and a lot of service move to, because it's where people are making trips. You can't just say, well, I wish we were in a different world than the one we're in. We're in this world now where people have different patterns. Meet them where they're at. Change the service patterns, change the distribution, go where people want to go. If that's the mountains, provide more transit to the mountains. If that's inner suburban trips, provide more inner suburban trips that don't require multiple transfers, right? Because people aren't going to do it. If it takes an hour and a half to get, from Littleton to Golden versus driving, they're not going to do it.
There is something about this that does require a significant amount of additional investment, right? Like,
Sure.
So if you wanted to take a bus route that kind of is like skirting south of downtown, lower density areas, and then have that connect to a north-south line that is just east of downtown, right? Both of those things by their nature today are going to be like hour or maybe 45-minute service. And so those transfers are going to suck. If you make that a one transfer system, it's like, gosh, I got to wait 45 minutes here for the next bus and there's nothing around. Correct me if I'm wrong. The only way to fix that is to just like throw a lot more money at it so you can have more operators, more buses going.
I mean, I would qualify that and I would say, like, I completely agree that I think we need more money for transit, and I would be the first person. I would be like the top cheerleader for getting more money for transit. Like, I would love that.
Jill Locantor is going to give you a run for your money for the top cheerleader for more transit money.
That would be a person I would love to compete with for that, and I would be happy for her to outdo me. She often does. But that acknowledged, right, there's a ton of stuff that can be done to just modernize our routes, right? To just modernize our scheduling, like James was talking about with the downtown plan. We're talking about expanding to the entire network of just saying, like, what are places people are going now? What are places that people used to go that they aren't as much? Where can we adjust? I think, a prime example of that is Rhino, right? Like, people live in Rhino, they go to Rhino all the time now. I don't think that was nearly as true 30 years ago. I wasn't here to see it.
Oh, you're right.
But, we're living off of these service patterns that were based on a time when that wasn't very much of a destination, right? And so we do have to make some adjustments, and there are absolutely things that we can do today that cost RTD approximately $0. Obviously nothing is literally free.
Sure.
But approximately $0 to just move around existing resources to be more efficient. That I'm not confident like the agency has taken the time to look into. And I think there are brilliant people at RTD who are capable of it, but I don't think it's been prioritized.
This is, I think, back to my earlier question. Expertise versus kind of a groundswell, I think is another kind of tension that is at work here, because I'll give you the example of like the Broncos ride or whatever, right? Like, you'll have a lot of folks who do not ride the bus to go to work on a given day, but like did use that service or like have a memory of using that service. And there's kind of a charismatic thing that can happen that even if it's not like the most effective use of any given dollar is actually like still like a great way of recruiting people and getting people interested. Yeah, I don't know. Do you guys have like a rule of thumb for like how to, well, actually, here's this like real one neat trick to modernize transit operations versus like, God, everybody's talking about this. Maybe we need to get behind like advocating for this service as well. Like, that distinction between the groundswell of the public and the kind of expertise that would really shave minutes, which become hours, which become days off of people's trips.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's both. I think like you definitely hit the nail on the head with like the Broncos ride. Like, there are just slam dunks that RTD could do for relatively cheap that we know would get great ridership, that we know would improve morale of staff and the public, like would radically improve their PR that people talk about all the time. I think another great example of that is like transit to Red Rocks, which I believe is in the works now, right? Which is something we've advocated for. There's just lots of things they're not that hard to do. They're slam dunks, and RTD needs to start being more flexible about it. I'll give you an example. I went to the Dragon Boat Festival last year and took a car because the existing transit to get out there was not reliable, and I couldn't convince the other people I was going with to take transit, so we carpooled. And it was a nightmare to park. It was a nightmare to get there. We were all parking on these like residential side streets, circling around the block, looking, trying to find a place, and it's like, just run special service. Like, RTD has to be willing to run special service for events. Like, you have to be flexible, because there will be these huge events that are not always going to be at a downtown arena, because like, I'll acknowledge that RTD will be flexible when Taylor Swift comes and sells out a show, and thank goodness. But there are other things that, they need to be providing service for too, especially because that's an opportunity for people to have a positive experience with transit which gets them in the door to using it more regularly.
Last year I went downtown for New Year's, and the last bus or the last train coming my way New Year's Eve was 11:56 p.m. So it's like, oh, I'm coming out
It's
for New Year's,
ridiculous.
but I'm going to leave 30 minutes early so I can go catch the train. Yeah, no,
And kiss the bus driver on the
Yeah.
way home.
Oh, wow.
What a loving story you had
Actually, maybe
that
there's
next
the perk.
day. Yeah,
That's how you capture the
so
choice
true.
riders.
So, I mean, on that note, so I was doing, I was collaborating with Lauren Hansen of Colorado History Rides on the history of Colfax, like a section of Colfax, and I'd found some newspaper clippings that were talking about how, you know, Denver is finally a proper city because we have 24-hour bus service on Colfax. And this was, I believe, in the 1980s, which is something we don't have today.
Yeah.
Right? It's like, even on Colfax, this place where, like, people are going out and drinking, they're partying, they're having a good time, and, like, more power to them. They can't get home by bus necessarily if they're out late enough. I mean, that's ridiculous.
Yeah, there's I think something to be said also for the events that you're talking about of kind of being the gateway drug to transit, right?
Yeah.
I think the A-line serves this role really well where
Yeah.
people are like, hey, actually the train was kind of sick. I just sat there, I read my book, I, had a phone call really loudly that annoyed other people. Like, it was great. And if you could do that to Dragon Boat Festival at Sloan's, or you could do that for New Year's Eve, right? All of these other things that normies might not typically partake in,
Right.
They might say, actually, that was kind of sick. I actually never realized how close I was to this bus stop or to this train stop.
Exactly.
And you might capture some more choice riders that way.
Let's imagine that a successful campaign does get underway. We just spoke with Jill Locantori of Denver Streets Partnership 2 episodes ago about a real desire to articulate what does real quality transit, what does doubling the frequency, more than doubling the number of people who have access to frequent transit, that costs a huge amount of money every year. But let's say we get $400 million a year or something like that. Or is it $800 million a year that they were talking about?
400 sounds right.
I think 400. I think it was $420 million a year.
That's right.
I think that's right. I feel really confident that was the number. Anyhow, but if we are able to mount a campaign of some sort, somewhere, somehow, some people that gets more money, what do you think are the real key things that need to be improved quickly in order to allow then the rest of an increased service pattern to kind of succeed? Or maybe not even that. I'm starting to get too granular. What would be the biggest swing we can make that we haven't made that just takes some money to get us there?
The absolute most powerful thing from a ridership perspective, from a climate perspective, from a public trust perspective, is to take those final steps to make the A-Line the strongest service, the flagship service that it should have been. One of the problems that we have with the way that Fast Tracks was executed was that we did not ask for enough money from the get-go. The 0.4% sales tax that they raised in 2004, even before the recession in 2008, was not going to bring enough money, to adequately pay for these lines. So decisions had to be made to get them done. One of them was single tracking the A-Line. As a consequence of that, because of kind of safety requirements, we can't run frequent service late into the night. So one of the things that happens is that people today, when they come home from a trip, especially on a Sunday night or something like that, and if it's after 7 or so, right, you've got a train only every 30 minutes. Compound that with whatever your transfer experience would be, because most people don't live adjacent to the A-Line, right? And all of a sudden, your transit trip is not competitive. God forbid you have to transfer to an hourly bus. After waiting, you miss the train, you got to wait another 28 minutes. So one of the things that we want to do culturally with the airport, since the airport is probably our single location where the largest amount of people from multiple poles of the metro all can, they come together, is we want to change the culture of people going to the airport is not driving on Pena Boulevard, right? The big thing we would like to see is people leaving their car, ideally near I-70, near the 40th and Airport Station. And by investing in double tracking just the northern part of the A-Line, there's 2 parts of this you can do. The northern part, it's a project that's already been teed up by the planners to do, right? We've estimated it's probably going to cost somewhere between maybe $200 and $300 million, including all the bells and whistles, right? So it's not an insignificant amount of money. But if we're talking about the most amount of people who we want to be turned on to transit, right? Making the A-Line that much more convenient, getting the trains running every 10 minutes during the peak of the day, but just getting 15-minute service later into the evening, right, would help, I think, take the edge off the beginning sticker shock of looking at your phone and being, oh my God, it is going to take me an hour and 45 minutes or 2 hours to get home. Where if I spend, $50 or $60 on an Uber, assuming you can even afford that, right, it's going to get you home in about 35 minutes, right? Yeah. And that is the thing. If you ask me for the single biggest thing, but it can't just be the A-line, right, in terms of what we would raise money to do, because we've got needs all over the network, right? We've got buses that could be more frequent in a lot of really critical places. We've got the G line that doesn't go to Golden, right? Downtown Golden, that is just a tantalizing opportunity. RTD owns the right of way. It's just a question of money, right? And then we've got, unfortunately, the Albatross, right? Which is the Boulder train, right? I think politically, the idea of raising enormous amounts of money at the RTD district level before there is something going on the Boulder corridor seems as though the consensus of those who've looked at the polls who've pulled this is that it's political suicide. Yeah. That just practically in Denver, even if some of us as individuals might say, hey, I could get maybe a bigger ridership bump here, or this might, be a really exciting other project. If we do not address this political promise that was made 21 years ago that there will be a train that goes to Boulder, getting the political appetite and restoring the trust among the political class in the legislature, which I think is very skeptical of RTD today.
And very Boulder-centric as well.
Yeah. I think the, plans if RTD were to do their own right-of-way, their whole shebang is like $2 billion versus the plan that RTD has for finishing fast tracks is like $600 million. You probably know better than me. What are your thoughts? I think people will care a little bit about this. What are your thoughts on kind of the new plan that RTD has proposed, and please describe it, versus kind of like doing their own thing all the way there?
Well, basically, the RTD picture versus the state's, the CDOT Front Range Passenger Rail picture has been very murky for a lot of people. So I can completely understand why someone would be really confused about who's doing what and how much it costs, right? But one of the things, you're right, James, to say that the full build-out, double-tracking, electrifying a train that goes all the way to Boulder and Longmont would cost, well over, $1.5 billion, probably more than $2 billion today. It would require right-of-way acquisition. It would be very complicated. It doesn't really seem as though RTD management or the board is really serious about pursuing that right now, given a lot of their financial constraints. There was another idea called peak service, which was talking about having basically 3 trains a day, 3 trains, coming southbound in the morning, 3 trains going northbound in the afternoon. The board looked at that and decided that that was not a worthwhile project either, given how poor ridership it would be. The future for the corridor right now seems like it's going to be a partnership between Front Range Passenger Rail District, CDOT, and RTD, getting eventually something on the ballot that'll hopefully get us 8 to 10 trains a day. In an intercity configuration, they'll make a couple extra stops in the RTD district that they wouldn't have in a purely intercity service, but this kind of blended approach seems like it's going to be probably the most politically viable. I think that's probably the GDT consensus.
Yeah, and I think, we're optimistic about the 8 to 10 train version. So I was just in Charlotte, North Carolina, actually. And
Paragon of urbanism.
Paragon of urbanism. Yeah. But there are often diamonds in the rough, because I had basically flown into Raleigh, visited some friends, and I took the Amtrak down to Charlotte and then took it back. And it was sold out, right? It was this hyper-local service that the state of North Carolina had paid into that only goes in North Carolina, is just going relatively short distances that people would normally drive. And as far as I could tell, anecdotally, it was doing great. So that really made me optimistic that if Charlotte, North Carolina can do it, then what would that look like in Denver? What would that look like in Boulder, in these places where, culturally, politically, people want these things. You talk to the average person, they're not anti-transit. They're just anti-wasting an hour and a half on a trip that they don't have to.
I think then one other thing about the B line, I think that's just worth kind of articulating here then. I just also think that it confuses people, the timeline. The partnership model that you've described, to me, makes a lot of sense. CDOT has, regulatory powers, another tax that provides a different service, which is not the RTD service, combined with RTD's kind of money that they do have, creates, a lot more opportunities than either thing could do alone. But, could you just like really quickly hit what is the actual problem there again? Like, is it just that there's like not enough space to put a second track? Like, I don't want to play dumb, but not everybody's listened to Ghost Train.
Yeah. Well, it's a great podcast. If you haven't listened to Ghost Train, I would encourage any of your listeners to check it out.
Yeah. After you go through the backlog of our podcast.
Yeah, correct.
Yeah, yeah.
Denver Urbanism,
Priorities.
of course.
Yeah.
But basically, the problem was the execution, right? Is that from the very beginning, RTD did not raise enough money. And then when they engaged with the rail owner, right, it's a private Class 1 freight railroad, BNSF, there was kind of a crazy proposition where they're like, okay, so you're a freight railroad. We haven't bought your tracks yet, but like you're totally cool with us like leasing your tracks and putting wires over them, even though you don't have wires over any of your tracks in any other parts of the country, not worried about the training at all. Like you're fine with that, right? And basically the railroad way of saying no is they don't say no, they quote you a ridiculous price. Yeah. And that is what happened back, I think I want to say in like 2013 or so, is when all of a sudden there was a clear consensus among the folks at RTD at the time. And I was an intern way back in the day. This is old lore. Back in 2014, I was actually an intern at RTD where I was trying to put these puzzle pieces together myself as I was still a student, when they had kind of this realization that we gotta do something else if this is going to happen, right? And that's where we're at today, which is we've got this really interesting opportunity where the Northwest Corridor, right, that goes up to Boulder and Longmont, does have a ton of ridership potential, but only if the train is frequent enough, right? Mm-hmm. If you're only running 2 to 3 trains a day, you're not going to have really strong ridership. But the problem is, because it's trains, in order to get 2 to 3 trains a day, you actually have to build a lot of infrastructure just to get that. So where our advocacy, I think, has been is that we want to make sure that whenever we take a swing, whenever we grab the bat and we want to take a swing at the ball with going to the ballot, we want to make sure we raise enough money that can build that infrastructure for the more frequent service, right? Where even if, we can't have, perhaps the level of service we would want, right, in the first couple of years, that whatever gets incrementally expanded upon by RTD, by CDOT, by FRPRD, whoever's doing this, that it's expandable.
Yep.
Okay, well, we thank you for that. We do have to wrap up here. Andy has a burning question that he wants answered so bad.
I just want to know, like, why is the 16 so great? Because the W does exist, but the 16 is also really great. I don't know. It's just like asking for a friend.
Sure. So, as someone who rides the 16 and the W, the 16 I would say is like just kind of fantastic for local service. It makes a lot more stops than the W. That's like one reason, and it like actually goes along Colfax, which like West Colfax rocks. So it's like great to be on transit on Colfax. Anything you'd add for why the 16 matters?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the purpose of the journeys are quite different, right? Is that I think when you're on the 16, you're often going to places on Colfax, like you said. Whereas the W, I think a lot of folks, especially from kind of the further western parts of Jefferson County, a lot of them, they'll park at Oak Station, they'll commute in, and it's kind of a different kind of experience. But the 16 is, it's an example of a really high ridership bus route. It goes through neighborhoods that have destinations that have, really around the clock reasons to be there, right? Mm-hmm. So what we're hoping is that over time, right, between Colfax, between Broadway and Federal, right, that we want to see between, Dottie and Denver, between CDOT, the municipalities, let's take an incremental approach. Let's not wait for, the hundreds of millions of dollars of program money for true BRT. Let's get the incremental upgrades going now. Right? Mm-hmm. Let's even if it's paint, let's get the lane, right? Let's get the dedicated lane for the bus. Let's get the transit signal priority, which is just unbelievably cheap to actually do on a per intersection basis, but matters so much in shaving those minutes off, right? Let's get that upgraded bus stop, right? I think, James, you can speak to this as well, just the dignity of having a bench, right?
Yeah.
True enough.
And you thought that was a silly question, James, but there was a good answer there. That's perfect. Well, thank you, folks, for being here. Thank you so much for your advocacy and your work, and we wish to see future successes.
Absolutely. Thanks for having us. Yeah, absolutely.
The Denver Urbanism Podcast is a production of longtime blog Denver Infill and sister blog Denver Urbanism. You can find out more by going online to denverurbanism.com. Thanks for listening. And, I mean, there's the pie in the sky version. Pie in the sky is maybe actually not the... There's
I'm going to cancel you for saying that.
Yeah, no, it's not a cancelable one. But I think I'd still
I'm going to try.